Joined on the phone today by author Dylan Jones, talking about his book, David Bowie, A Life. Dylan, how are you today?
I'm doing great, Dustin. How are you?
I'm excellent. I'm glad to be speaking with you.
Me too.
Well, let's talk about your new book, David Bowie, A Life. It seems like it's more than just your regular biography. Can you tell the listeners a bit about it?
Well, there are a lot of books about David Bowie, some good, some bad, but most of them just focus on his career. And I wanted to produce a book that actually investigated the man himself. So as well as all the people he worked with professionally, I speak to his friends, his lovers, people who had deep and meaningful relationships with Bowie, but don't always get the limelight.
Yeah, it seems like a lot of people were interviewed, a lot of work went into the book. How long were you working on it?
Well, 15 months and all my life. I mean, I've been a lifelong Bowie fan. I interviewed him 7 times whilst he was alive. I've interviewed lots of people in his world over the years. But then, for the purposes of doing the book, I interviewed 150 people in about 15 months. So it was a lot of work. But I figured that there were the 50 people that you need to speak to in order to be taken seriously as a David Bowie biographer, like the Tony Viscontis and the Nile Rodgers and the Carlos Alomars of this world. And then there are the 50 people who perhaps don't get as much airtime, but probably knew David Bowie just as well, the film directors, the film producers, the photographers, etc., etc. And then there are the other people, the other 50 people, when you're interviewing someone and they go, well, have you spoken to Kevin? And you go, well, who the hell's Kevin? And then you endeavor to find and interview Kevin.
Well, yeah, with a life and a career like David Bowie had, and all the different facets, it must have been difficult to even keep it all contained into just one book.
Well, it's all in the editing. I mean, and also when you're talking to people, some people you're interviewing and you think, this is amazing, I'm going to get 3,000 words out of this. And other times, people might have a very important story, but it might only be a very short story. But I think the interesting thing is that, I wanted to speak to people who really knew David Bowie. And it's not a hagiography by any stretch of the imagination, but I wasn't particularly interested in speaking to people who had fallen out with him, who had wars of attrition with him. But even the people who felt perhaps that they'd been a little bit used and a little bit sort of, dropped during the years, no one felt aggrieved by it, because I think the trade-off of working for David Bowie or knowing David Bowie was enough.
Well, again, Dylan Jones with us, and his book, David Bowie, A Life, is out now. And you mentioned getting a chance to speak with David Bowie a few times. What was that like exactly? Was he open with a lot of things? Because he seems like he was, I guess, a bit reclusive sometimes.
Well, I think he became reclusive, but when he was engaged in promotion and interviews, and when he was just engaged in conversation at dinner, he was incredibly animated because he was a very curious person. I mean, he had a huge curiosity. I think a lot of celebrities, a lot of performers, a lot of rock stars and actors feel like the publicity side of things is a chore. They don't really want to do it. They don't want to give you anything. They don't want to divulge any secrets. Bowie was sort of the opposite, and he really wanted to engage. He wanted you to have a good time. So even though you felt like you were being played a little, it kind of didn't matter because it was full of content. It was a very rich conversation.
Well, his death came, as a major shock to the fans. Did that have an effect on your book as far as how to end it and where it was going, or were you maybe still working on that when it happened?
No, one of the most difficult things was actually interviewing people who knew him very well and also knew that he was ill just after his death about his passing, because it feels a bit macabre, like ambulance chasing, to do that, but it had to be done. But the overriding sense was one of, apart from terrible shock, was one of gratitude that they'd actually been in his orbit, that they'd actually known him.
Well, can you maybe point to something that was, I guess, most surprising that you learned during your research, or something maybe a lot of people would be surprised by?
I think an obvious one would be his complete uninterest in fashion. I think that you can look at David Bowie and think here's the guy with the orange hair and the strange clothes. He's always reinventing himself. He's a bit of a dandy. He's a bit of a this. And actually, that was sort of the opposite of what he was like. He understood fashion, and he understood how to use it when he was creating personas, when he was creating stage performances, album covers. He understood it in the same way that he understood literature and film and dance and performance. But in real life, you know, if you had dinner with him or he came for an interview, he'd look like he'd turned up to fix your refrigerator. I mean, he didn't really have any interest in fashion. He thought it was a bit kind of silly, really. It was just work to him.
Yeah, I guess that just goes to show the kind of effect that he had on his fans. You know, even had the big hit with the song "Fashion" and kind of just knew where to go with things and you know how to make that persona work.
Yeah, I mean, he said, you know, whenever he was you know, you'd see him around town, he'd be very, you know, very casually dressed. In fact, he used to say that the best way to walk around a city and not be noticed was to wear a cap and carry a Greek newspaper.
Well, it's hard to imagine, you know, another artist like David Bowie coming along, someone who had the kind of career and, you know, the longevity. You know, maybe, I guess Prince comes to mind, but even he's gone now. So, you know, it's hard to think that somebody like that might come along again.
Yeah, and also I think that these days, because of social media and because the distribution channels of music are so different, that you don't really have to engage with an audience in the same way. You can just do it through pictures and through music. It doesn't appear to be necessary to actually engage with them and to actually talk. And I think one of the most amazing things about Bowie was that the vast amount of interviews that he gave and the way that he engaged with people, he really felt a connection. He wanted a connection with his fans and with the people who appreciated his music and with critics and with musicians. It was all about communication, and I think we've lost that these days, actually.
Well, Dylan, you mentioned being a lifelong fan, so I got to ask, is there a favorite album or maybe a period of his career for you that you always go back to?
I think the Imperial period was the 70s, and I think the Young Americans and Station albums are pretty tough to beat, actually. In fact, when I was researching, I was in LA a couple of times last year researching this, and it amazed me to find out that when he was recording Station to Station, when he was probably at his most extreme in terms of the austere way he behaved and the vast amount of drugs he was consuming, that he used to have dinner most nights with Frank Sinatra, who was recording it in the same studio.
Yeah, it's amazing all the different sounds and styles and, you know, even characters that he developed over his career, but they never came off, you know, kind of forced or phony. He always seemed to be able to pull off whatever he wanted. Yeah,
I think that the only time it looked forced was towards the end of the 80s, after he'd had the huge success with Let's Dance. I think he started to anticipate what his audience wanted and became overtly commercial. And actually that wasn't what his audience wanted at all. They wanted him to keep developing. And so he went through rather a rut then, I think, but then sort of redeemed himself towards the end of his career by making increasingly experimental records.
Yeah, it's definitely a fascinating career. And again, the new book, David Bowie, A Life, out now. Dylan Jones with us. I got to ask you, Dylan, I know this book is just out and you probably want to take a break for a while, but anything else maybe coming up or anything else in the works?
I got to go back to my day job. I edit GQ in London. And, you know, like everyone else in the media business, it's work at the moment.
Well, again, I appreciate you taking the time out with us. And David Bowie, A Life, out now. And Dylan Jones, thanks a lot for being on with us today.
Absolute pleasure. Take good care.
And again, that was author Dylan Jones. His new book, David Bowie, A Life, is available now.